Hi everyone and welcome to the first Malkovich of the Month award from Killegar Chess. Every month Killegar Chess is going to award this prize for the most entertaining Malkovich game played on the site during the month. In case you don't know already, a Malkovich game is a game of chess where you write down your thoughts after every move. On Killegar Chess they're being recorded in spoiler tags so that everyone can read them, and it's making for some great spectator chess. The best game this month was awarded to the game played between SMBC1997, who's a personal friend of mine from Cavan Chess Club, and another player called Bepi. SMBC, whose first name is Sean, turned 14 this year, and the level of his play was superb for his young age. He had the white pieces and opened with his favourite d4. Bepi answered with knight f6, going into one of the Indian defences, in particular after c4, e6, knight f3 and b6, the Queen's Indian. Bepi wrote here that he was vying for control of the central light squares for active play. Sean continued with g3, which is a continuation that's logical because it makes it possible to contest the long diagonal with a bishop g2 and in the event of bishop b7. And this is one of the ideas that Bepi could have in mind with his move b6, bishop b7 or even bishop a6, which is more common. And Bepi elected for bishop b7, and so Sean continued with bishop g2, and now came bishop e7, and both sides castled. And at the moment white has a better pawn center, and black has control of e4 with his pieces, which prevents black from advancing there with his pawn, immediately establishing an ideal pawn center. So thus far the position is approximately equal. Here Sean played d5, which is an interesting temporary gambit that's seen in these variations. And it gains space and hopes to exploit the coming pin on the long diagonal in the event of e takes d5. And in later analysis the computer thought that knight c3 simply was slightly better. It's preparing d5 and also e4 after something like queen c2. So e takes d5 anyway is what Bepi played, and now came knight h4, exploiting this pin so that there can be no d takes c4. And Bepi now broke that pin and defended the pawn he's won with c6, but white already has good compensation for the pawn after c takes d5 and knight takes d5. Playing instead bishop takes d4, or playing bishop takes d5 here is obviously not an option for white, because he'd be murdered down this long diagonal. And Sean went for e4 here, which is gaining a tempo on the knights, and an interesting alternative was knight f5, which is threatening to win the bishop pair, which would have been strong on this open board. In their notes to the game, both sides realized afterwards that it would have been better to play this move now, as the immediate e4 allows black to trade some pieces where the strength of his extra pawn will become more obvious, especially if an endgame can be reached and white can't exploit the temporary compensation he has for the pawn in black's lagging development. Here, for example, if he wants to save the bishop pair, black can play bishop c5, now comes e4 and knight c7. If instead knight e7, white has the nice shot knight takes g7, where after king takes g7 he can play b4, which is going to win a very powerful dark square bishop given the open long dark diagonal to the black king. And there are no escape squares for the bishop here because the knight is on e7. It can't go to d6, and it can't go to any of these squares on this diagonal here. It can take on f2, but this opens the f file for attack as well, which is unadvisable. And if bishop takes b4, queen d4 check wins the bishop back, and white now has excellent compensation for the pawn in this continuation. So knight c7 would be the right move, but but now comes b4. You know, it's still playable here, and we'll win the bishop pair finally in the event of you know, bishop e7. Let's just simply knight takes e7, and you know, this b pawn is badly poisoned thanks to the very powerfully posted knight on f5, which I think is Kasparov's favorite attacking square for a knight. You know, if bishop takes b4, then queen d4 will attack the bishop and threaten mate on g7. So, you know, it will win the bishop. And an alternative defense from black is to take advantage immediately here of the freshly weakened long diagonal after b4, with queen f6, where white can sack the exchange with b takes c5, which is a very deep combination, as after queen takes a1, queen c2 threatens bishop b2, then there'll be no queen takes a2 thanks to knight e7 check, king h8, and then bishop takes g7. It's going to discover an attack on the queen at a2, and the only move to try and hold out is queen f6. If instead queen e5, then bishop f4 is going to win a piece on this diagonal, you know, for 2 pawns after an exchange of queens on c5, which is the correct move. So queen f6 would be best, but now bishop b2, and white has a powerful attack for the material investment thanks again to this knight on f5 after queen d8, which is by far the best and most prudent move. Anything else is much worse for black. But now comes bishop takes g7, rook e8, and queen b2, which, you know, both pins black's b pawn, so there's no b takes c5 here, and threatens knight h6 mate. And the only way for black to defend against it is rook e6, where after knight h6 check, rook takes h6, bishop takes h6. White's advantage is clear as day. Okay, so back to the game continuation anyway. Sean has just played e4, and Bepi took the opportunity to trade off some pieces with bishop takes h4, which, you know, removes a piece from white's kingside and reduces attacking chances there. And Sean didn't want damage done to his kingside pawns, you know, with g takes h4, so he played e takes d5, which gains a tempo because it forces the bishop to move. And Bepi moved it to f6, which is a nice diagonal for the bishop and puts some pressure on b2 and prevents white's dark squared bishop from developing for the moment because of this pressure. And you know, playing instead bishop e7 would have just blocked this e file anyway, which is a crucial positional element. And here Sean played knight c3, which is normal development that has the added bonuses of lessening the pressure on b2 and overprotecting d5, which is an important square. And here white has little for the pawn, but black's development is somewhat hampered by the central pawn situation. And Bepi elected for knight a6, which is a logical way to bring the knight into the game. Sean also continued logically with rook e1, who's taking control of the open e file. So now came knight c5, which is a good square for the knight. And Sean continued development with bishop e3, aiming for bishop takes c5, and then later knight e4. And after rook e8, he continued with d6, which is planting a thorn in Bepi's side and aiming again for bishop takes c5 to disorganize the black pawn structure. And Bepi now elected to expand on the queen side with a5. Another possible idea was bishop a6, which is aiming to exploit the d3 hole, which can lead to some sharp play for black if white is not careful. For example, if bishop f1, casually aiming to keep a firm control of the position, just you know, keeping control of d3, black is doing excellently after bishop takes f1, king takes f1, bishop takes c3, b takes c3, and knight e4, attacking both the d6 and c3 pawns. And you know, black is already 1 pawn ahead, and if he wins the second one, it will probably spell curtains for white. White can try queen d3 to defend both pawns, but now comes queen f6, attacking both of them a second time. You know, often a queen and knight work very well together, and this is certainly a case of that. This allows white the tactical shot bishop takes b6, which is discovering a second attacker on the knight, but now black can defend again with queen f5. And bishop d4, you know, the bishop has to be saved. This is the best square, but now black continues with c5, which is going to win at least the exchange. Bishop takes c5 is the best that white can do. If instead bishop e3, this is the point of c5, then knight takes g3 check, and there's no queen takes g3, and after the knight is taken, the queen on d3 is won. So after c5, bishop takes c5 is best, but now black has queen h3 check, breaking the pin and winning the bishop on the next move. The only other option was rook takes e4 for white a couple of moves ago, which, you know, just loses the exchange for not enough compensation. Okay, back to the game continuation. Bepi played a5, and Sean continued with queen d2, which is, you know, connecting his rooks. Was his main idea here, as well as finishing development, and this allows for rook takes e1 in the event of a later rook takes e1, which is almost definitely a preferable recapture to that of doing so with the queen. Bepi continued with bishop a6, and in his notes he wrote that he felt d2 may not have been the best square for the white queen, and that c2 may have provided more play. In analysis, the computer was of the opinion that there was not much difference between the two. So Sean continued with bishop takes c5, which is, you know, the plan that he has in mind, and he felt it was a forced move, and it certainly seems like a good course of action to prevent a later knight d3, etc., and aim for active play against the damaged black pawn structure. Black remains a pawn up and also gains the bishop pair after this, but white now has almost total compensation for the pawn. Before recapturing on c5, Bepi traded off a pair of rooks with the rook takes e1 in order to avoid losing a tempo, which would have happened had he recaptured on c5 immediately, as white would have rook takes e8, you know, gaining a tempo on the queen after queen takes e8 and rook e1. However, you know, this also gives up the e file, which contributes in no small part to white's compensation in being a pawn down. So now, of course, came rook takes e1 and b takes c5, and Sean continued with b3, keeping his position solid before playing knight e4, which is the next key move for white to strengthen his position and try to create attacking chances. Sean noted here that Bepi does not have much opportunity for active play, and that's true. His position is pretty solid, but he has to be careful. If he gives white too many moves for free, then there will be surely attacking chances. And g6 is what Bepi went for, noting in his Malkovich comments that he was finding it hard to come up with a constructive plan, and he was concerned about his weaknesses on c5 and d7, which are attackable with ideas like knight e4, bishop e3, and rook e7 if they're permitted. He wanted to reroute his bishop to f8 in order to defend and defend these weaknesses, and attack d6 as well. And he felt there was no way to hold on to the pawn that he'd won, and in order to reroute his bishop, that's why he played g6. And he felt that there was not that much options regarding active play, and his idea was to aim for a later c4 to generate some kind of play here on the queen side. And Sean continued with bishop h3, and it's a good move because it improves his worst piece, which is always a good idea if you can find nothing better to do. And from this square it has an active post and a nice diagonal, and it's adding a bit of pressure to d7. And as Sean noted, the immediate knight e4 does not achieve too much after bishop d4, and You know, with this move, bishop h3, if bishop g7 is played next, then rook e7 can be played with tempo as it attacks the weak d7 pawn. And after a lot of consideration, Bepi chose to play rook b8, which is moving his rook to the semi-open file and hoping for active play later. It applies some pressure to b3, and as his plan is to play c4 later, the b file may well become open. So all in all, this is a good move too. The other moves he considered were bishop g5, with the idea of playing f5 after the queen moves in order to prevent knight e4. For example, if queen c2, f5, and you know, this blunts the action of the h3 bishop as well. So it seems like a sound and logical continuation with regard to prophylaxis, but in fact it gives white more of an edge after knight a4, and Bepi was worried about the weakening of his king's position, which is certainly a factor here too. Another move he considered was rook a7, which, as he pointed out, is definitely eccentric, although it defends d7, and perhaps later rook b7 and queen b8 can be played, which might give some active play with a c4 or a4 push pending in the opening of the b file. The final move he looked at was the immediate c4, but he felt it was too soon to play it just yet. So back to the game continuation. Rook b8 is what he did play. And now came knight a4 from Sean, which was an unexpected move and a good one. This attacks the loose c5 pawn and gets the knight to a good square with tempo. You know, when it takes on c5 is the good square because it's going to be attacking the bishop on a6, and white now has a small edge overall in the position, which is significant as black has the bishop pair and at the moment an extra pawn too. So you know, white's position is good here. And the timing is now ripe for the c4 push, and Bepi played it now with the c4. And as the game evolved, this was a critical moment, and you'll see why after a while. And it's interesting to look at why some other defenses fail here too. For example, it might seem logical to play bishop d4, you know, defending the c5 pawn and getting the dark squared bishop, which is a powerful piece in this position, to a great central square from where it dominates the knight here at the edge of the board. However, thanks to Sean's earlier bishop h3 as well as his thorn pawn here on d6, he would now have rook e7, and suddenly white's edge is close to a pawn despite being a pawn down, so he has a very strong position here. There are a few different ways to deal with the pressure on d7, but none of them are satisfactory, and white is doing well in all variations. Playing bishop c8 is a bad blunder after queen e2, and white's control of the e-file is going to win the game. The immediate threat, of course, is rook e8, winning the queen, but there's also queen c4 to contend with pressure on f7, and from here there's just no way to prevent a crushing attack from white, so Bepi did well to avoid this line. So c4 is what he did play. And now came knight c5, attacking the bishop, but Bepi played c3 before moving it, and you know, he can do this because it's attacking the queen. And so Sean moved his queen to f4 with the idea of putting some pressure not only on the bishop but also on f7. Bishop c8 is going to be forced next in order to defend d7, and white can follow up with bishop f1 to c4 in order to intensify the pressure. So it seems like a good plan, but in later analysis the computer thought that e3 was a better square for the queen. We have a look, and now there's total control of the e-file, and knight e4 coming next, which is going to win back the c3 pawn. Here bishop c8 is forced, and now comes knight e4, and white is doing well. A sample line might continue c2, and now rook c1, a4, and rook takes c2. If instead b takes a4, rook b2 gives black good counterplay. So rook takes c2, a takes b3, a takes b3, rook a8, and white retains a small edge in all variations. So queen f4, and now bishop c8 is forced in order to save the bishop and defend d7. And next came knight e4, which is attacking the bishop for a second time and also preventing bishop g5. And white has a healthy edge now at about half a pawn, which means he has good attacking chances here because he's a pawn down. Bepi elected to defend the bishop with his king, which is the best defense available. Moving the bishop to g7 instead would make f7 vulnerable, with ideas like knight g5 and rook e7 being very hard to deal with. However, now white can reroute his bishop, as I mentioned with bishop f1, because black's light squared bishop has been distracted from the a6 to f1 diagonal thanks to the pressure on d7, and it can't return there because the a6 square isn't supported by any black pieces. So it's all very nice play from Sean, who was slowly but surely increasing the strength and activity of his pieces and his position. Bepi went for rook a8 next, allowing for bishop a6 on the next move in order to challenge Sean's control of this strong diagonal, and also to support a later a4 push. And Bepi felt there was little else active to go for, and that his position seemed passive. It would have been more consistent to play rook b4 or a4 immediately, with good counterplay, more consistent with his previous play. And this idea with the rook a8 and bishop a6 comes a moment too late, which Bepi foresaw but still played, as Sean can now play bishop c4, which he did, and now all of his pieces are beautifully placed for attack. And Bepi aimed to get the light squared bishops off now with bishop a6, which seemingly refutes any ideas that were behind this bishop maneuver to c4, because they will apparently now be traded off, the light squared bishops. But Sean found a great move here. If you want to try and spot it, then stop the video now. Bishop takes f7 was the move, which is a great shot, and now he has regained the pawn and created a strong attack on the black king. Bepi played bishop d3 next, having calculated that he could not capture the bishop without dire consequences, and now his position is much more active, and very quickly the game has become open and tactical. We can have a quick look at king takes f7 just to show what's going on. If king takes f7, then oops, hold on now. Queen takes f7. Now there's a knight takes f6 with all kinds of menacing threats. The knight is going to move with a discover check next, which will lead to a devastating attack. And there's no queen takes f6 or rook e7 check. Not only wins the queen, but forces mate. So it's a very nice move from Sean. Bishop takes f7. So bishop d3 is what Bepi played, and now came knight c5, which is the only move for white to retain the edge in the position. And this is attacking the bishop so that it has to move, and if king takes f7, there's just knight takes d3, and white's doing well. So Bepi moved his bishop now to f5, and from here it's defending the black king and also the weak d7 pawn, and supporting the advancing of this passed pawn, which white is going to have to keep an eye on. So this is a very useful move, and now we have the rare sight as well of 3 bishops on adjacent squares. And again here there was no king takes f7, or sorry, not knight takes d3 of course, or rook e7 check is the correct move, and it leads to a totally crushing attack. So bishop f5 from Bepi, and now g4 from Sean, which is the best way to press forward and continue the attack for white. Playing instead rook e8, gaining a tempo on the queen, looks tempting, but black is far better after queen takes e8, bishop takes c8, and rook takes c8, where all the initiative and play will be his. He has a bishop and a rook against the queen, and the passed pawn ensures a lasting advantage. White has to defend against rook e1 check, and will be devastating in conjunction with the advancing of the passed pawn. So the only move here is queen c1, but now comes instead rook e2 with all kinds of threats like rook b2, c2 and rook b1, as well as the immediate bishop d4, and black's winning from this position. White's best hope at defending is to sack a pawn with g4, and after bishop takes g4 play king g2, but now again bishop d4 forks the knight and the f2 square. So knight d3 saves the knight and defends f2, but now bishop f5 threatens to win the knight, and then a pawn on f2. So queen d1 defends the knight and attacks the rook, but here black has bishop e4 check, forcing king g1, and now bishop f3 threatening rook takes f2, and discovered attack on the queen. So knight c1 is the only satisfactory defense, but now comes bishop takes f2 check, forcing king f1, well, rook e1 check, queen takes c1, bishop takes c1, king takes c1, and king f6 leads to a completely winning endgame for black. So g4, and Bepi countered with queen b6, attacking the loose knight on c5, and Sean countered back with queen c4, which is a nice move that defends both the knight on c5 and the bishop on f7. Playing instead g takes f5 lessens white's edge after queen takes c5, and the black passed pawn here confers a big edge, and white will be forced back and faced with defense, even if he plays f takes g6 to avoid retreating the bishop, because now comes c2, and black is winning from this position. So queen c4, and now bishop takes g4 from Bepi. It's exploiting the pressure on the c5 knight here. So there's no queen takes g4, or there's queen takes c5, and black will remain a pawn ahead with the initiative to boot. And Sean again found the best move here with bishop e8, with the menacing threat of queen f7 check, as well as renewed pressure on the d7 pawn, and this was nice and accurate and results in a sharp and double-edged battle. One slip from either side and it's all over here. And as I said before, playing instead queen takes g4 results in a very tough position. After queen takes c5, bishop c4, and rook d8, where white will have to keep a constant eye on the c3 pawn here. It's going to be very difficult, and the opposite colored bishops will definitely favor black from here on for attacking chances. So bishop e8 and rook takes e8. An exchange sacrifice is how Bepi elected to solve his defensive problems, and it was a bold step that he said was purely intuitive. He is a strong passed pawn for the exchange and a powerful bishop pair, as well as relief from the pressure on d7. However, there was a better defense, although it would have taken nerves of steel to play it. It was c2, allowing queen f7 check. If instead queen takes c2, despite giving back the passed pawn, black is gaining an edge after queen b4, attacking the rook on e1, and best is rook e4, which is forking the queen and the bishop, but now black has a nice shot bishop f5, which is gaining an edge in the event of the continuation. Rook takes b4 and bishop takes c2. However, this allows white to sack the exchange instead, where the bishop takes d7, leading to the forcing line. Bishop takes e4 and knight takes e4. If the queen captures and the knight's hanging on c5. And here it's white who's won a pawn for the exchange, but objectively speaking it's a very equal position. After bishop e5, bishop takes c6, and black is doing better than in the game continuation, but Bepi went for the risky, dynamically imbalanced choice, and one can only praise that even if it isn't best in the cold light of day. So the other option for white was queen f7 check, as we saw after c2. So queen f7 check, king h6 is the only move. Now knight e4 threatens to mate with queen f8 check, bishop g7, queen f4. So it forces rook takes e8, and now queen takes e8. But black is still better here than in the game continuation. So all things considered, it appears c2 was the correct defense as opposed to the immediate exchange sacrifice. Okay, back to the game continuation anyway. So rook takes e8 from Bepi, and rook takes e8, of course, from Sean, who was somewhat bemused with Bepi's exchange sacrifice, but he noted the power of the bishops in this position as well as the dangerous passed pawn here on c3. And after this move, rook takes e8, the bishop on g4 is attacked by the queen, and Bepi moved it to f5, which was, a brave choice because it allows an attack on his king. The only other option was queen b4 to defend it, but this leads to a very difficult endgame after the forcing line. Queen g8 check, king h6, and now knight e4 threatening to take the bishop on g7. And defending against queen f8 check is crucial if black wants to defend. So bishop g7 is a must, but now comes queen f7 threatening to mate with queen f4 check, and again forcing bishop f5. But now again queen e7 threatens mate on both g5 and h4 and forces the queens off, because queen takes e4 is forced here. But now comes queen takes e4, bishop takes e4, rook takes e4, and it will be very hard for black to hold this for a draw. So Bepi made the correct choice with bishop f5 here. And now came queen g8 check from Sean, which is easily the best move, and now white's edge is growing rapidly in the position. Black has only one response, which is king h6, and here Sean came up with a creative but unfortunately inaccurate continuation with rook e7. Stronger and more forcing was queen f8 check, where after bishop g7, queen e7 threatens queen h4 mate and makes the c5 knight immune from the queen. The only way to defend the black position here is with queen b4, just defending h4. If instead h5, then queen takes g7, queen takes c5, queen takes h7 check renders a winning attack for white. So after queen e7 and queen b4, queen e3 check forces g5. If instead king h5 and knight e4 threatening queen g5 mate, forces bishop takes e4, where white is winning easily after rook takes e4 with a mating attack in the works. So after g5, we've seen knight e4, and it's again forcing bishop takes e4, and now white has the strong intermezzo h4 threatening mate on g5, and the best answer is bishop f6, but now rook takes e4, queen takes d6, which is the only move if black wants to hold out. Now h takes g5 check, bishop takes g5, and white can continue his attack with the rook h4 check, exploiting this pin, forcing king g6 because the king has to defend the bishop. But now comes queen e4 check, king f6, queen f3 check, king g6, queen h5 check, king f6, and rook h3, winning a pawn back after h6 to defend h7. Now rook takes c3 with an enduring edge, as he's the exchanger up for a pawn, although the win is not simple, but he should be able to maintain the pressure without too much difficulty. And with the black passed pawn gone, there's little to worry about. Black will be on the defensive here, and this pawn here, for example, can be targeted. But as I said, Sean missed this line, and we can go back to the game continuation, which was rook e7. So Bepi played queen takes c5 here because this last move with rook e7 left the knight on prise, and you know, Bepi found a good move in declining the sacrifice, and from here on the scales will start to tip in black's favor, although this move takes very good calculation. However, upon deeper analysis, it becomes clear that taking the rook was in fact playable and winning. If we have a quick look, bishop takes e7. Black's looking good after d takes e7 and c2. Even after queen f8 check, black has simply king g5 and not king h5, or white is winning with queen takes f5 check, g takes f5 and queening with check, which maintains the initiative with a winning attack. So king g5 is the correct move, sorry. And now h4 check, and king takes h4 is suicide after queen h6 check. So king g4 and now queen h6, preventing the c pawn from queening, which is the only way to stay in the game, and giving up a piece temporarily after queen takes c5. And now all white has is queen g5 check, and king f3, which is forced to avoid mate, and queen g3 check forces the king onto the e file, and king e2 is the correct move. King e4 allows perpetual, and now queening with check, but now black has the incredible resource bishop e6, and the only move to keep white in the game is queen g4 check. But now comes king d2, and despite having two queens, white is busted here. He runs out of checks after queen f4 check, king d1, queen f3 check, and king c1, and there's no way to bring the e8 queen into the game quickly enough, and it will not be long before the c pawn queens, and black will be a piece and 2 pawns up. For example, if queen h8 threatening queen a1, so simply king b1, now queen e4, which is pinning c pawn, stopping it from queening, but bishop f5 solves that problem. Now queen e d4, c1 queen with check, king g2, and the nice tactical shot bishop h3 check, where there's no king takes h3 or queen h1 is mating. So king h2, and now queen takes d4, queen takes d4, queen f1, and it's game over for white. So it was safe to take the rook after all. So back to the game continuation anyway. Instead of bishop takes e7, Bepi just took on c5 with his queen, and Sean wasn't worried about that because he knew that after queen f8 check, you know, which is his only move to keep the balance as long as possible, Bepi has to give the piece back with king h5. He was worried about h4 check in the event of king g5, and you know, this move is going to allow him to play c2 after queen takes f6, and he correctly calculated that white had no mating attack, and the resulting was not to be feared in this position. If king g5 instead, h4 check, and king g4 is fine. After queen takes f6, black has h6, which defends against queen g5 check, and white's initiative runs out very quickly, more quicker than in the game continuation. And you know, on the contrary, black is doing very well thanks to his passed pawn here. But the game continuation is much the same anyway. After king h5, Sean played queen takes f6, which is, you know, white's only hope. If instead rook takes h7 check, king g5, queen h6 check, king g4, queen h3 check, king f4, queen g3 check, king e4, rook e7 check, offering the rook again, and this time it's correct to decline it with king d5, and black is winning easily from here. So queen takes f6, and now c2, which is the killer move, and as I said, you know, there's no mating attack for white here. The king can escape via the light squares, and what can white do about the passed pawn, and the simple answer is nothing. And we shall see. The game continued. Rook takes h7 check, forcing king g4. Now queen h4 check, again forcing king f3. And queen g3 check, king e2. And by this stage the outcome of the game was becoming clear to both players. Sean soldiered on with rook e7 check, but now came bishop e6, and there's no way for white to continue the attack. Sean tried rook takes e6 check, but after d takes e6 he resigned, saying that there was no way to prevent the queening of the c-pawn and that he would eventually run out of checks. After, for instance, queen g4 check, king d2, queen f4 check, and king c3. And from here black can't queen his pawn, but after the best move from white, d7, he can play queen d5, threatening queen d1 check and preventing white from queening his own passed pawn. So it was a great game from the two players, and congratulations to both of them for receiving the Malkovich of the Month award. It takes two to tango, and they produced a dynamically imbalanced and sharp game together. We can have a quick replay with the threatened squares so we can see the game from start to finish. Here we go. So it was Queen's Indian, which is actually an opening I don't know that well myself, because generally I open with e4, and against d4 I play the King's Indian. So I learnt a bit when I was doing analysis of the game too, which was good. And yeah, this early pawn sack is an idea that you see in Queen's Indian positions quite a bit, and there are some nice trapping lines, but it's definitely the case that knight f5 was better than e4 there. Both players realized that later. And yeah, the pushing of this pawn to d6 definitely crammed black and stopped him from kept his queen behind the lines, for a lot of the game. And that in combination with rook e7 was wasn't an ideal move. It was a creative move, and Sean showed a lot of creativity in his thinking, which is amazing because he's only 14 years old, and so that was great to see too. And also his pawn sack was a very creative idea, and yeah, overall he played very, very well. And it was unlucky, he just let it slip. He played all the right moves. He was daring in his pawn sacrifice, and he found this nice combination here with bishop takes f7, and he was very unlucky that he didn't win this game. He got all his pieces to the right squares, he got a good positional advantage, but just goes to show that one small slip is all it takes, and you can lose everything you've gained so far. And there's a couple of lessons to be learned from this game. Nimzovich's idea of blockading passed pawns is very relevant here, and also Petrosian's thinking that you should defend all your weaknesses before you attack. And I think both of those players would have taken care of this passed pawn before undertaking an attack. So that was very important. Although it would have been irrelevant if the kingside attack had been executed, with perfect accuracy. It would have been winning. So yeah, it was a fantastic game, and I hope you all enjoyed it. You should come and join us at Killegar Chess. We've been having a great time there talking about chess and playing Malkovich games and live chess against each other. So please leave any comments or thoughts. Thanks very much.